This crisis of a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a racism crisis are all interconnecting because of the climate crisis.
A gente está começando mais uma edição do nosso Conversas GPIT, né? Esse é um evento que a gente tem realizado semanalmente, né, para conversar sobre territorializações em tempos de pandemia. Então, tratando as questões urbanas que, para nós, assim, parecem fundamentais, tanto com relação às dinâmicas urbanas, como de alguns outros fenômenos urbanos e transformações sociais, né? A gente já falou de cidades e de estados do Brasil, depois a gente partiu para um bloco internacional, com casos da Argentina, Colômbia, Equador, Bolívia e Portugal, e hoje a gente vai falar a situação dos Estados Unidos, e a gente tem como convidado o Michael Manser.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce our dear friend and colleague, Professor Michael Menzer from Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, teaches philosophy and environmental studies, and he is a honorary member of GPIT and our partner and colleague in the research that we've been doing on participatory community transformation. As many of you know, we had a very big conference at UFRGS in late September, early October, and he came down to Porto Alegre to be our keynote speaker and participate in all the activities. He has been one of the leaders now in the world around participatory budgeting, which began here in Porto Alegre, but eventually made its way to New York City. And through the participatory budgeting project, as he described for us last September, the participatory budgeting is now citywide in New York City, so it's going even bigger there than in Porto Alegre. And he has been an advocate for participatory budgeting as part of the whole idea of participatory democracy, including his great book, We Decide. And the article that Eber just shared on GPIT is an excellent article that really forwards that whole agenda. I recommend that everyone read it. And so we're delighted to have you talk with us today about, you know, as I think we all know, New York City was the epicenter in the entire world for the COVID-19 crisis. There's no place anywhere on the planet that faced a greater challenge and a more difficult situation than New York City over the past 4 months. So we're very fascinated to learn from you the story of that, and also how you project the future impacts of that on urban life. So welcome.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks everyone. And I had my hat on at the beginning, and it was great to be part of this group and this project on democratic community transformation, participatory community transformation, having been at the big events of last September. And this is a 5-year project. We're in year 2 roughly, and really looking forward to continuing to collaborate going forward, and hope to see everybody in the flesh at some point. We'll be patient, but that'll happen. And it's an honor to be with this group and see some old friends here with Mel and Danny and other folks who I met when I was in Brazil in September. And this is quite a day to do this event, because last night the New York City Council agreed to pass the budget for New York City for this year. And it was a big fight, and nobody is happy. And many people are very, very angry on what happened. There were thousands of people outside of City Hall protesting this budget and what was about to happen. And the City Council, the majority of the City Council, went ahead and passed it anyway. I bring this up because I think we're in New York City and in New York State and in the United States, we're entering into an extremely dangerous phase, because the different states are about to pass their budgets for next year. And as we've had the coronavirus health impacts hit, and then the accompanying economic impacts from the shutdown and the closures. States and cities have been especially hit hard in terms of their budgets because their budgets come from property taxes, sales taxes, and other fines. And just because people aren't going out and they're not riding the subway or they're not taking the bus and they're not buying things, the cities are having and states are having major, massive shortfalls, 20% of their budgets, 30% of their budgets. And right now, we are having this conflict about how do we deal with this, and the United States Congress is not helping right now. As you also know, to some extent, I'm sure, we first had the COVID crisis, especially in February in New York City, and then the economic crisis starts to quickly follow. And then we have the crisis over the police. And this was, in some ways, unpredictable, but in other ways, not shocking at all. Not only had there been many recent high-profile, especially horrible incidents of police violence against unarmed Black men, against who were committing no crime, and so on. But during the pandemic, as it happened in New York City, especially as you started to get to April, there were lots of restrictions about people going outside, and people were required to wear masks. And what was happening is that white people who weren't wearing masks, generally no one said anything to them. But if you were Black or Latino in New York City, and especially male, but also female, and you weren't wearing a mask, police were grabbing you, arresting you, finding you, and so on. And it was so blatant. It was just, and there were lots of videos of this. And I had students and people I work with who were telling me about this, who were Black, who were telling me about this. And it was just the worst of both worlds, because the Black community and the brown and the Latino community in New York City was being hit so hard by the health crisis, and also by the economic crisis, and also by the police. And so I want to touch on all of those today. And I'll pause here.
Então, basicamente, o Michael tratou de um assunto bem interessante, que é dos protestos que aconteceram na frente da prefeitura, em protesto justamente ao modelo de orçamento que estava sendo passado na noite de ontem. E a população, então, se engajando visto toda a questão da crise econômica, da pandemia, e ainda assim o Conselho ele aprovou esse orçamento mesmo com, né, esses problemas evidentes. E essa é uma fase que está acontecendo em diversos estados também, que se agrava pela questão da crise do coronavírus. Ele fala que existe um impacto de cerca de 20% a 30% do orçamento da gestão pública e de algumas empresas também, a maior parte das empresas, e que isso, então, vai ter um impacto direto em como essas decisões de orçamento participativo, elas vão afetar a população e como essas demandas vão se modificar a partir disso. E aí, nesse contexto, entra a crise do sistema de saúde, a crise econômica, e, por fim, então, a crise da violência policial, né, que acabou, então, trazendo um sentimento de revolta muito grande, porque era muito claro a seletividade da polícia ao tratar de questões que eram comuns durante a pandemia, por exemplo, o uso de máscaras, ou, enfim, a manutenção de distanciamento social. E essa violência, essa represália era muito mais forte e claramente violenta em relação à população negra, à população de imigrantes. Então, isso gerou um sentimento de revolta muito grande que culminou nesses protestos. Então, basicamente isso, assim, que ele tratou nesse primeiro bloco.
All right, thank you. And always thanks to the translators. Obrigado to the translators always. So this crisis of a health crisis, an economic crisis, and a racism crisis are all interconnecting, and they're all interconnecting in a moment where global capitalism and cities are already on the edge because of the climate crisis. And so many have been trying to put forward proposals and programs to adapt to that, but really not getting over the hump in terms of reducing emissions or in terms of creating the new ways of living and the new ways of inhabiting urban space that we're going to need in terms of food, waste, water, transportation, education, and jobs. And I know it's been great to talk to Mark and his work and with others in Brazil about how cities are doing this. And so as we see these incredibly intense historical crises play out, urban spaces have to adapt immediately. And you can see different cities across the world, because unlike the climate crisis, which a lot of them have tried to not, they're not dealing with as urgently as they should, the pandemic requires an urgent change in terms of how people work, how people get around the city, how people get food, and how people make their basic needs, meet their basic needs. And also just how do we create social situations and social conditions for our own mental health and well-being and so on. And it's fascinating to look at, the Asian cities which have more experience with dealing with epidemics because of, especially over the last 10 years. And so Seoul, South Korea, and Taipei, Taiwan, and Beijing, and many Chinese cities, and Tokyo, they've all had a much quicker and more nimble response, which is not to say they've been perfect. But of course, in the United States, where there's not a lot of experience with this, it's been much more difficult, and cities haven't even been able to do simple things well. And New York City is certainly guilty of that. For example, New York City has really failed to make more streets to take the cars off and to allow for more pedestrians and to allow more space for social interaction. Other cities in the United States have done a little bit better on that. San Francisco and Oakland in California have done a little bit better. Seattle has a different dynamic happening. So there's a lot of fascinating real-time comparative urban analysis that can happen with respect to the pandemic and the economic crisis that I know scholars around the world and researchers are looking at, because we need to be able to make changes immediately. I do want to say one thing that New York City has done well, although not as much as it should, but has done very well, is be able to get food to people who can't afford food or can't access food. And they basically have used the schools, the New York City public school system, which has 1 million children in it, 1 million go to school. All the schools are distribution sites for free food, not just for the students, not just for their families, but for anyone in the neighborhood. And I think the city deserves great credit, and elected officials and nonprofits and lots of small businesses have done an amazing logistical maneuver to be able to deliver a lot of that fresh food, a lot of that food, and get it. But there's other problems that are kind of resulting from that, because a lot of the food is unhealthy. And of course, being unhealthy with this particular public health crisis and COVID makes you more susceptible to the disease, right? So how do you get healthy food? But again, we've already been struggling with healthy food for many years for many reasons, right? And so the pandemic just intensifies the struggle around that, but also the urgency at which cities have to respond. The other thing I would mention is that, or maybe I'll pause there. I'll pause on that.
Então, nesse bloco, ele falou bastante sobre a crise climática, como é um problema que o mundo todo vai ter que se adaptar, e como a pandemia, ela deixou isso muito em evidência, né? Evidenciou problemas de uma incapacidade de adaptar as cidades dentro dessa urgência, né? Então, cidades asiáticas geralmente têm um maior sucesso em adaptar os modos de vida, enfim, adaptar os sistemas logísticos para as pessoas poderem se locomover com segurança, ou, enfim, poderem levar uma vida com segurança, dado o contexto de pandemia, e que no Ocidente, em principal nos Estados Unidos, então, cidades tão densas quanto as cidades asiáticas, enfim, elas não têm essa mesma capacidade de atuação de emergência. Então, ele acredita que essa é uma das grandes lições que a gente tem que tomar, principalmente levando em conta esse contexto de mudança climática, que vai exigir uma readequação do espaço urbano e dessas movimentações. E ele fala que São Francisco foi uma cidade que conseguiu adaptar o espaço urbano para trazer uma maior mobilidade no sentido de aproximar as pessoas com segurança e de dar prioridade a esse aspecto, então. E aí, por fim, ele fala de uma grande conquista que ele enxerga do ponto de vista da pandemia, é a capacidade que Nova York teve de organizar refeições para distribuir às pessoas que não têm acesso à comida por causa da crise. Então, ele conta que, por meio do sistema educacional, criou-se um sistema logístico em que as pessoas retiram seus alimentos nas escolas. E que, enfim, um problema que emerge disso, mas que já existia antes da pandemia, é a qualidade dessas refeições, né? Existem muitas críticas a esse respeito. E se pensa, então, em um momento de crise da saúde pública, como que se lida com essa questão, né? Como trazer uma alimentação mais balanceada, mais saudável às pessoas em um momento que elas precisam estar com um sistema imunológico forte, enfim. É isso.
Thank you. So the next part I'll go on to has to do with police and Black Lives Matter and structural racism in the United States. With the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which rightly has just caused such grief and frustration around the world, especially in the United States, especially in the Black community in the United States. The protests that emerged from that have been astounding, bold, creative, comprehensive, and literally game-changing in this moment. This Black Lives Matter movement has been around for many years in different forms. It's the recent name and movement really came out over the last 4 years after a series of murders of unarmed Black men outside of St. Louis, in New York, Eric Garner, and there were unfortunately too many. And as this murder happened, combined with the disproportionate suffering of Black communities because of COVID and the disproportionate suffering among Black communities because of the economic crisis, this was, literally the incendiary device that sparked this new wave of protests. The United States that were in all 50 states across the entire United States, not just in cities, and that's hugely important because very rarely do you see protests across the entire United States. And that agenda, the Black Lives Matter agenda, is not just about police, but very importantly, it is about reducing the police budget. And the basic idea is that the police do not make us safe. They do not make us safe, especially when you look at the range of things, the range of duties that they're asked to take on. And police budgets in New York City have increased, even though crime is going down. Police budgets were going up. And that doesn't make sense. I mean, that just doesn't make sense on many, many levels. And so right now, one of the immediate demands has been defund the police, divest from those militarized budgets and invest in communities. And that can be a very simple thing of the police should not be responding to mental health calls, right? The police aren't good at that. They don't like to do it. Why not have mental health professionals respond to mental health crisis? So they're very sort of simple, seemingly very, who could challenge that? That just makes sense on every level. It's also cheaper, by the way, to have a mental health professional than to have the police. Then there are deeper ones, though, concerning not just the police practices, but the prisons. And what does reparative justice look like rather than incarceration or what's called the carceral state? Another big issue has been police in schools. A lot of times the criminalization of Black youth, it happens very early. And we had a very powerful moment where the leader of the state Senate in New York State, who's a Black woman, Andrea Stewart Cousins, when she said this law was passed, her brother had been a police officer and he quit. And she asked him, why did you quit after many years? And he goes, because it felt like my job was to make sure that every young Black male had a record, to make sure that they were all somehow entered into the police, into the prison industrial complex, or what's sometimes called the schools to prisons pipeline. So that's also part of this. So it's the schools, it's the police budgets, it's also how we invest in housing and how we invest in jobs and how we invest in schools and in our neighborhoods. And this is what's called divest, invest. And I wrote this essay that I think Mark had just sent around, and people could kind of look through that. So that's another huge, and in a sense, one of the most creative, dynamic, bold parts of the situation, and maybe even almost the leader movement in this situation. And I'll pause.
Thank you. Nessa parte ele foca bastante na questão do racismo estrutural, do surgimento então desse movimento que surgiu que existe já há algum tempo, mas que com a pandemia se criou uma situação perfeita para que implodisse, então, essas revoltas, e que esse sentimento, então, que é tão latente já dentro da população negra norte-americana, esse sentimento, então, ele pôde encontrar uma maneira de escoar a partir dessa violência que iniciou, enfim, com a morte do George Floyd. E é interessante notar como foram protestos de grande impacto em todos os estados, né? Não foram movimentos espraiados, né? Enfim, parece algo bem uníssono. E, em geral, se fala de como a Covid ela acaba matando mais a população negra e como isso gera esse sentimento de indignação frente realmente ao descaso com essa parte da população norte-americana e também uma repressão muito forte a qualquer tentativa de se mostrar contra o sistema. A segunda parte, ele fala sobre como a polícia precisa ter cortado seu orçamento, que ele é muito desproporcional ao que a polícia deveria estar fazendo de fato. E que uma das grandes crises que os Estados Unidos passa nesse momento é a crise de saúde mental. Então, problemas que a polícia está lidando, por exemplo, eu acho que nesse sentido ele não falou disso, tá? Mas eu acho que se encaixa, por exemplo, problemas de drogas, enfim, isso não necessariamente são crises de segurança pública, né? Então, essa atenção também é uma sensibilidade muito grande que se tem que ter. E uma coisa interessante que ele falou mais para o final foi sobre uma líder do Congresso em Nova York, que ela trouxe que o irmão dela era policial e que ele saiu, enfim, que ele deixou a polícia, por ele entender que o papel dele não estava sendo proteger as pessoas, mas sim garantir que o maior número de pessoas negras tivesse um registro, enfim, junto à polícia, tivesse uma ficha criminal. Então, isso acho que demonstra grande parte desse sentimento que acabou não se constrangendo somente as pessoas negras, né, mas, enfim, trouxe à tona essa revolta.
All right, thank you. So in this moment of divest, invest, the attempt is to have cities and states and the federal government defund the police and invest in healthy communities in a way that helps to dismantle structural racism and also enable community control and community power. And that's where things like participatory budgeting comes in. That's where things like the solidarity economy comes in, and worker cooperatives and consumer cooperatives and so on. This is happening at a time when state budgets are having tremendous shortfalls because of the crisis, as I said earlier, shut down so much economic activity. And where particular parts of the economy won't come back anytime soon. So restaurants unable to open, bars, a lot of tourism, hotels, as well as other related parts of the economy. And then before that, we had already started to see retail, right? Because of online purchasing and Amazon.com and so on, retail was already undergoing a crisis. So, and that's very important to mention, right? So we not only did this COVID crisis hit with this economic crisis with Black Lives Matter and the structural racism crisis, but this is happening with the climate crisis already happening, and also with the big tech takeover of our social life, of some government functions, and of the direction of the economy. So Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, and so on. So they're all coming in together. You know, so we mentioned earlier, not only do we have the pandemic, but we have the locusts, and you have, you know, the locusts here and the grasshoppers in Porto Alegre, and you have the locusts. So you have the seven, you know, the seven plagues. But we also have these multiple crises, which are all literally. And so, and how do cities function as spaces that can put forward a way of budgeting, a way of investing to deal with these changes, and also to create spaces so that people can literally inhabit and have a social life to be able to function through this incredible transformation. And I know we could get into this more, but I kind of just sort of distinguish that as a question. In terms of, I'll pause there, and then maybe do one more.
Então, o Michael, ele reforçou a questão das crises simultâneas que estamos todos vivendo, né, enfim, por fazer parte de um sistema capitalista, e que é papel cada vez mais forte, então, do Estado, enquanto uma instituição mais possível de abranger a sociedade, de investir nos lugares certos, né? E para existir esse guia de saber onde existir, é muito importante ter a participação comunitária, ter essas políticas públicas voltadas a uma maior participação das pessoas nas decisões que vão afetar a vida delas nas cidades, né? Então, é um dos grandes desafios que a gente encontra, que existe uma queda muito expressiva na renda e no fluxo de caixa do Estado, né? Por assim dizer. E como esse Estado, então, vai reverter essa crise em algo que tem que ser reaproveitado pela população, né? Então, é uma grande preocupação de como a vida urbana ela vai ser impactada por esse modelo e como as empresas também vão ter que, de alguma forma, atuar para compensar o que foi perdido agora, né?
All right, thank you. So, in terms of, and maybe I'll go on for about 5 more minutes, and then we'll stop, I think. So, in this last part, I would offer the following. We have a number of opportunities here, and there are also a number of very dystopian trajectories that we could jump on. And I'm just going to talk about it from the standpoint of cities. From the standpoint of city, one thing that we fear in this moment is one where there's gated communities, cars, this whole distancing of elites and others from the regular life of the city, literally from the street and from the schools and so on. And elites and others get more disconnected from the everyday space of the city because it's dangerous, because it's not healthy, and because they can make their living and extract their capital from other kinds of activities. And that we have then combined with those folks who are essential workers who cannot work remotely, who are often Black, Latino, or low income, who are more vulnerable to the virus, more vulnerable to the economic situation, and also become more separated to services that can help them. And this is because especially of defunding of hospitals that have happened in the United States since the 2008 crisis. And the 2008 crisis is very relevant in this moment too, especially because the number of hospital beds in the United States has decreased since 2008. So that's that sort of dystopian model where cities empty out somewhat. There are less people flee, and you start to get these sort of gated communities that are racially divided, economically divided. And the whole mixing and the melting pot and the inclusion of the city that we're struggling to recapture is further lost. It's going to take a couple years to get through COVID if we're lucky, I think. I mean, this is what I have family who live in China who've been doing with it there. And I don't think there's a quick bounce back here. And that's going to be very difficult for cities. It's going to be very difficult for cities just with their spatial configuration, especially, cities that have the mix of the politics and demographics and density that US cities do. But again, looking at Asian cities, how they've handled this, but with a very different political model. I think the other thing is that now more than ever, democratic control of budgets is necessary. Now more than ever, democratic control of budgets is necessary. We saw the New York City Council, who was one of the most progressive city councils in the United States, and the New York City mayor, who at least some think is one of the most progressive figures in the United States, fail miserably last night in the budget they delivered. There were easy things they could have done in terms of defunding certain parts of the police, but they did not do. Recognizing it's an incredibly difficult moment in terms of economics, and I could go more into that. So this is an argument for participatory budgeting to and other forms of participatory planning and so on. This is the moment where it's almost a do or die moment to have more democratic control. Movement for Black Lives is calling for it. We need all the other groups. The environmentalists have been calling for it. Now we need all kinds of other folks calling for it. And I'll pause. I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Para fechar esse último bloco, se fala muito de como é um período que a gente está vivendo, ele é único na história, e junto com isso ele traz algumas possibilidades, no caso de existirem oportunidades de melhora, mas ao mesmo tempo algumas possibilidades um tanto quanto distópicas e preocupantes, né? O Michael fala que na projeção dele, e não dele necessariamente, mas na melhor das hipóteses, né, que se acredita, que para sair da crise gerada pelo Covid vai levar ao menos uns 2 anos, né? Então, para se recuperar em termos de orçamento, em termos de vida social, de uma normalidade, né, ao menos uns 2 anos. E então, nas cidades existe um medo muito forte de que esse distanciamento social forçado agora, ele vai levar a uma clivagem ainda maior entre o que a população da base da pirâmide social experiencia na cidade e o que as elites têm como experiência na cidade, né? Então, existe um desgaste dos espaços públicos pela questão da pandemia, né? Um desestímulo ao compartilhamento, e como isso pode afetar negativamente, então, essa integração desses espaços e a integração social. Então, é necessário ficar muito atento a como essas mudanças, elas vão afetar também essas populações mais vulneráveis, no sentido de que, hoje em dia, os trabalhadores essenciais são os que menos têm acesso a direitos básicos, enfim, e quem tem mais recursos é quem normalmente consegue esse acesso à saúde, aos espaços mais seguros, né? Então, essa exposição, ela vem junto de uma estigmatização social também, né? Quem está na ponta do iceberg é quem vai ser mais prejudicado. E aí, por fim, então, ele retoma a questão de como é importante tu ter um controle democrático desse orçamento, uma participação das pessoas nos processos de tomada de decisão, e aí ele traz uma crítica de que, nessa aprovação de ontem, né, do orçamento de Nova York, que mesmo as lideranças mais progressistas não conseguiram inserir nessa pauta mudanças, né, de investimento na polícia, por exemplo. Então, pequenas mudanças que poderiam ter sido feitas não foram levadas a cabo. E acho que, então, uma das possíveis perguntas que a gente pode, algum de vocês, eu, enfim, podemos fazer é por quê, né? Porque o que faltou para, no momento em que se chama tanto por essa mudança, por que não existe uma mobilização nesse sentido, né?
Vitória, deixa eu sugerir que tu já faz a questão em inglês para o Michael.
Michael, I'm going to ask you the first question, and it's due to your last speech. And I was wondering, why is it that the most democratic leaderships, they weren't able to pass these new changes that are so important to be tackled in these meetings? And in your vision, why is it that they could not make this effort, or is it because it did not depend only on them, or it's some bigger issue? What, in your vision, what is the problem there?
In terms of New York,
Michael, I think it'd be good if you could just give a little bit more detail about, because we're not familiar with this. What was the debate? What were the different sides? What did the council do that the protesters didn't want them to do?
Got it. So the protesters, the defund the police movement, had been able to pressure many different cities across the United States, most famously LA, to take a chunk out of the police budget and put it into community programs and proposals that had been already discussed and formulated through sometimes what are called people's budgets, and sometimes through participatory budgeting processes. And New York City did not do that. So what New York City did was, the New York City police budget is about $6 billion officially. It's actually more than that when you look at some of the benefits and pensions and so on. And activists were asking for $1 billion, $1 billion, to go to programs for especially Black and Latino communities to address basic needs in housing, health, education, and so on. And what happened was, the mayor, who made adjustments to the budget. Now remember, this is a time when the New York City budget has to be reduced by billions of dollars because of shortfall of revenue. So it's a very bad situation. There's been no help from the federal government. And the federal government said they're not going to act for a couple weeks. And this is really the Republican Senate, Mitch McConnell, and this is probably more of a Mitch McConnell thing than a Trump thing. It's not clear Trump actually cares too much about this kind of stuff. But Mitch McConnell wants states to default. He wants them to go bankrupt. He literally wants them to go bankrupt. So that's the first person to blame here, and because there's only so much that states and cities can do. The Federal Reserve and the Department of Treasury just print more money. States can't print more money, right? So that's what's happening. So because of that, states and cities are forced to make these cuts because there isn't funding to replace them. So New York City had reduced by about $5 billion out of a $92 billion budget going down to about $88 billion. And so it made sense to actually take about at least $1 billion out of police because the police budget had increased by over the last 4 years. It had increased $1 billion, even though crime was going down. So why not take that money, put it into communities that needed them the most, that have been subject to police violence? And they did it. About 400 million, you could argue, did go to that kind of stuff, and about 600 million did not. And the worst part, really, for me, was that they tried to pretend that it did. And they moved it from the New York Police Department budget to the Department of Education budget for basically the school guards and for the police in schools. But people didn't want them funded anyway. And so not only did they not put the amount necessary, but they tried to deceive the public in terms of how they were moving the budget, moving the money around. It was one of those moments. And it's like, how do you try to do that in a moment like this, right? And there were 17 city council members out of 51 voted no, including ours at Brooklyn College. I got to give much credit to Farrah Lewis. So that's what happened. And there are other cities, and again, everybody's kind of doing this right now, who are trying to take a chunk of that money that has gone to police to put it into the services that better address the community needs and also give communities more power in this moment. And so we've seen calls for participatory budgeting in these people's budgets across the US. Oh, but sorry. So why did he do that? Why did he do that? Well, it's I have to say it's tricky to answer that question. I mean, from what some of my insiders have told me, and and this is, I'm saying this publicly, so here we go. It's fear of the police. It's literally fear of the police, and it's fear of the police in two ways. One is the police have money, they make donations to candidates, there's that kind of stuff, the Police Benevolence Association. But the other is that when de Blasio got rid of what's called stop and frisk, this policing procedure that the Black community was very much against, and then de Blasio agreed and then helped to get rid of it. The police said that they pulled back and they didn't patrol nearly as much as they were supposed to patrol. And they were, in a sense, going on a kind of strike, right? They were not doing all the work they were supposed to do. When the police did that, by the way, crime went down. Crime went down, okay? But the fear is that in this moment, if he cut the police a lot, then the police would not cooperate. They would literally not cooperate with the city. And that means you're in a revolutionary moment, folks. I mean, if you want to talk about what is the sign of a revolution, it's when the monopoly of coercion becomes undone, right? The course of force doesn't cooperate with the government anymore. And this happened to New York City in the 70s, for your historians of New York City. Fear City, Mark, is what they call it, Fear City, when the cops said, don't come to New York City. So people, de Blasio thought, rightly or wrongly, that we could be entering into that kind of moment. And this is speculation. He has not said this publicly, but this is from what I've heard from folks.
Great, thank you. Então, eu já traduzo agora, eu acho, né? Enfim, para não perder o fio da meada. Ele fala que boa parte do motivo que levou a esse comitê de orçamento participativo não levar adiante essas mudanças foi realmente pelo corte dos orçamentos, né, em geral, e porque a quantia de dinheiro disponível e que foi realocada para projetos sociais, ela não foi o suficiente. né? Então, de fato, existiu uma diminuição no que foi o contingente direcionado à polícia, e parte disso foi direcionada para essas demandas sociais relacionadas à educação, moradia, enfim, mas que isso não foi o suficiente, né? Eram valores irrisórios perto do que deveria ser direcionado e em comparação ao que foi direcionado de fato para a polícia. E aí, em relação a um panorama mais geral, né, por que existe, então, mesmo com todos esses protestos, todo esse movimento, por que existe ainda uma resistência em fazer essas mudanças, ele cita um episódio em que o prefeito de Nova York, ele passou um projeto, uma emenda, vamos dizer, que ela limitava o poder da polícia em um determinado aspecto, que eu não peguei a tradução direito, mas era relativo a como essas forças policiais, elas reprimiam uma tática de polícia específica. Então, quando o de Blasio ele passou essa emenda, enfim, houve uma forte reação por parte da polícia, no sentido de entender que, naquele momento, a polícia perdeu a sua independência, a sua autonomia, então isso legitimaria eles a quebrar esse pacto institucional e a deixar de cooperar. Então, na minha cabeça, vem muito um cenário, assim, de coringa na cabeça, sabe, aquela coisa assim, o caos, né, a polícia então não vai agir, então vai aumentar a violência, mas o que o Michael falou é que nesse período em que aconteceu isso, que a polícia meio que entrou em greve, o que aconteceu foi o contrário, foi que a violência diminuiu. Então, esses pequenos paradoxos, assim, que se criam, né, pelo medo da polícia, na verdade, pelo medo do que a polícia pode fazer ou deixar de fazer, caso existam esses esvaziamentos, né, esses desincentivos à sua atuação.
Michael, let me ask if you could talk, given the budget crisis in New York City, I'm wondering, you know, we had this situation 3 years ago in Porto Alegre where the new mayor came in and he said, well, I'm still for participatory budgeting, but we don't have any money to spend on it, so we would just do things that have already been approved and not have new rounds. Is the situation in New York with the citywide participatory budgeting, is that still going to go forward, or has that been put on hold for lack of funds?
It's not clear. I think that, and many people think that it's on hold. Some people think it's not going to happen. And given that the budget was just passed last night, I don't think we'll know until the federal budget happens and then the states and so on. But officially, it's not even clear to say that it's what the official stance is. It's a lot of confusion. But it's not clear that it's going forward. And there's no process. I'm part of the advisory council designing the process. I actually have an emergency call today after this event. And we're going to do something, but it's not like there's we were hoping for $500 million and it's going to be statewide. That is not the case. But I can tell you, some people have told me that it's canceled. And my response is, no, it's not. It's something, we're going to do something. Otherwise, but we have a very strong group and we're going to fight. Let's put it that way. And the demand for it now is bigger than it's ever been. There's a national, it's across the US. The other cities are trying to do this now. And here we are with the whole process set up and we're not doing it. What is it? New York? What is this?
Então, o Mark perguntou basicamente como é que ficava, né, a posição referente a esses cortes, ao congelamento, e o Michael disse que está tudo muito confuso ainda, né, enfim, existem muitas incertezas no nível federal, municipal, mas que a projeção dele é que vai existir algum posicionamento, né, enfim, essas coisas não vão passar batidas, e como o movimento está só crescendo, a intenção é justamente chamar mais atenção para esses problemas e realmente tentar agir de alguma forma sobre, enfim, as possibilidades de redução do orçamento, enfim.
So hey there, Michael. My name is André. I'm a PhD student at the Federal University in Rio. I was a master's student. Eber was my supervisor, and I wanted to do a follow-up question to your previous answer. And it goes a little bit like this. There's a huge difference in how police and state structure is structured between the US and Brazil. most of the policing in Brazil is done by state police, and in the US, the police is actually under the county or the municipalities, and state polices are mostly policing highways and so on. So there's this disconnect in Brazil between local communities and the power that decides on policing, right? So I was just reading your article that calls for upscaling of the participatory budgeting, and my question would be, how effective would it be to have this kind of participatory system in state level? And another question related to that would be about how the different cultural contexts think about police in general. From my understanding, police is viewed in good eyes, even through all this crisis because of police violence in the US. There's this, it's very noble to be a policeman. And especially after 9/11, I think this kind of narrative became more popular, at least for us looking from the outside. And it also means that cultural meanings for police vary greatly between cities, because the police forces are pertain to the cities and municipalities. How do you think that all works in the sense of being able to actually impact budgeting for police forces in different contexts?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And the first question, PB at the state level, do you mean at the state level in the United States or Brazil?
Well, I would say in abstract, how could we envision like a very effective PB system when it's not that connected to local communities?
Okay, so I think that, well, in Brazil, you have your own state, in Porto Alegre, Rio Grande do Sul, right? They had the statewide PB for 3 years, and it had a variety of difficulties and some partial successes. I think that in the United States, there's a couple issues. One is that the states are so different in terms of population and geographic space. Like, it's just crazy, you know. Tiny ones with a few people, big ones with a lot of people, like Texas or California, and some very unpopulated. But my view on this, and not everybody, not everybody agrees with me. I'm not saying this is the consensus, but I think when you get to larger scales, you should do it by sector. Okay, so like in New York State, we have we have a lot of environmental and sustainability and climate change adaptation initiatives that communities feed in. They do participatory processes and they formulate their priorities. A lot of them are very similar. And then that should impact on the state budget, right? In terms of how the state budget does that. And we have a process that we just did called New York Renews, and it attempted to do a kind of participatory version of this, and it's not going well. The governor has too much control over it and so on. But if that, you could imagine what a PB process looked like for the state, and you'd have different representatives from different communities all working, but in a sector, not for the whole budget, but for a sector. I could see that working in energy, climate and environment, health. We have a lot of interest in health in the United States, especially now. Transportation. In California, they were looking at PB to do transportation, right? Which are both state-funded, regional networks, local. So I think that sector PB is sort of my response there. Don't think about it as the whole state budget and then having a whole PB for the state budget, but within specific sectors that really need, and the state needs, public participation to know what to do and what's the most effective proposal. In terms of the culture and the narrative, oh man, Mark, right? We could go on and on about this. It's amazing to watch the United States since the 1970s on the military and the police and how people look at the military and the police. The military after Vietnam, right, low point, not a lot of public respect. People aren't going to the military. And it takes decades, going into the 90s and 2000s, where then the military becomes something that is much more highly respected by the American public. Not that people are joining the military, by the way. It's more and more immigrant. But anyway, on the police, the cop show, right, Mark? Half of the television shows in the United States, like in the 1980s, were about police and how great they are and how they have to abuse everybody to get the job done. I mean, that was like half the shows on TV. There was a huge culture war after the 60s and 70s on the defending the authoritative institutions in the culture against the people. And the cop show was a big part of that. And I will always tell you, tourists love NYPD more than people in New York love the NYPD. All right. And, you see the tourists come. There's lots of people in the let's put it this way. There's people of different races in the United States who do not like the police. Some of them are white, some of them are black. It's not uncommon. I grew up in the South. There's plenty of Southern whites who don't like the police. So, but yet there is this narrative and this romanticization and so on that goes deep. And it's the guns. It's also gun culture in the United States, right? You have to talk about gun culture. And it goes back to slavery. It honestly goes back to slavery and the notion of the militia. And it goes back to structural racism and white supremacy and the fear that cop puts into people on the wrong side of the tracks. So it's a deep problem. But I think that there is, and maybe some of it's generational too, with just a different view of police.
Bom, então, para traduzir, o André fez duas perguntas. A primeira era voltada à imagem que se tem, né, da polícia, enfim. Não, essa é a segunda, desculpa. A primeira fala sobre o orçamento participativo a nível estadual, né, quais seriam, então, esses desafios e como que seria estruturado de forma a ser mais efetivo, né, as políticas criadas a partir dele. E pela resposta do Michael, então, nos Estados Unidos tem uma variação muito grande entre os estados em relação à concentração, tamanho, localização, então são demandas muito difusas. E aí, na visão dele, o que mais dá certo seria, então, setorizar essas demandas por meio, enfim, saúde, mudanças climáticas, energia, educação, e a partir disso ter as delegações tratando sobre esses temas, né? Então, talvez dividir não por regiões, como é comum dentro do sistema do AP, mas sim pelas temáticas. E aí a segunda pergunta, então, ela diz respeito realmente à cultura que se tem de culto, talvez, à polícia, enfim, a essas imagens militarizadas. E aí o Michael conta que depois da Guerra do Vietnã, então, houve uma desglamorização, né, dessa imagem do militar, enfim, e que a polícia ela passou um processo diferente, né, que a partir dos anos 80, então, eu acho que dá para fazer um paralelo com a grande guerra às drogas que teve nos Estados Unidos, né, foi uma política muito ostensiva, assim, de guerra às drogas, mas, enfim, são parênteses. Então, existiram muitos programas de TV, enfim, diversos filmes que tratavam sempre o policial como o cara, né, o bambambam, enfim, e que isso acabou moldando muito como a sociedade americana, na média, enxerga, né, a polícia, o uso de armas, enfim, existe toda uma glamorização desse processo. E em relação aos militares, então, ele vai trazer que, a partir de 2001, né, do 11 de setembro, existe, pelo contrário, assim, existe um esvaziamento, né, uma imagem um pouco negativa, talvez, de como se enxerga a ação militar e essa presença norte-americana em regiões, né, periféricas.
Vamos lá, agora o Weber, então, por favor.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for your speech. And I think I have three questions for you. The first about the effects of big techs in this time and the future effects. I know this is issue interested to, especially to André Paul, about the big tech effects and so the future of this situation. But the second question is about in this context of the pandemic in the world, where is the role of the modern state? and because I don't know, but I think there is the part of the problem, in the fight against the virus is part because there is the crisis of the modern state, the nation state, and I don't know, but I think the PB local experience has an effect about this idea of the modern state. The experience of the local PB, and so it's not three but 4 questions. So, and the other in the very important because I remember you spoke about it in September in our seminar, about the economic effect from the PB experience. Well, it's not the democratic experience only, but is the PB experience has a economic effect. It's not only not just in the state, but in the economic activities too. And so, how do you think about it in this crisis? Because the Brazilian economy, the people speak about the crazy in 10%, around 10%, 9% in Mexico, 10%. So the Latin American, I don't know, but around 10% of the crisis in this year, because of the pandemic. I don't know. In the US, I think so around it in the Western Europe too. And what's the effect in the process of the rebuilding, the economic rebuilding, the whole of the PB. And for last, because this is a subject in our last article about what exactly the moral effect of the PB experience for you. Do you speak up? Did you write about it in article? No, about the democracy experience. But there is in our approach the moral perspective in this experience. What is?
Okay, thanks, Eber, for those 4 delightful questions. Okay, first on big tech, Google, Amazon, so on. It's a nightmare scenario. There's no 2 ways to describe it. This is worse than I ever could have imagined as someone who fears the takeover of the government. Forget the economy, just the government. And the idea that Google and Apple are going to get together to do your contract tracing, which they had talked about. And by the way, they couldn't even figure out how to do, which is fascinating. And the fact that we're on Zoom or video chat, where all our experience now is now archived and processable and surveilled in different ways, it means more of our human experience is subject to what's called surveillance capitalism in the Shoshana Zuboff framework. And in China, and this goes to, in the China's response, China has that tight relationship between corporations and the government, so that your phone, right, you have to show, and my family that live in China, if you want to go in a restaurant, you have to show your phone, and they look at the app to see if you're green, yellow, or red. And if you've been around people with COVID, you're red and you can't come in. If you haven't, you're green. So the point is that the big tech is a corporate capitalism side, and then there's also a government state side to it. And they often interconnect in ways that we don't always understand. China's one model, the US is another model. What this moment should make us do is that we cannot wait any longer for public controlled tech. And there's a lot of debates there. I'm not saying there's an obvious way to go forward, but we can't just sort of hope for the best and eventually we're going to regulate it, or eventually we'll break up Amazon. We're way past that. We have to have public control, whether it's government or mixed models of cooperatives, what's so-called platform cooperativism. We have to get going on that immediately, because big tech's scope has massively increased because of the pandemic. From the Amazon side of delivering the goods to the Google side of we're on Google Meet. The modern state, wow. You know, and Eber, I was thinking of you because relatedly here, what happens to the global city, right? What happens to the global city in this moment of a pandemic where airports are closed, right, and all that? Because the fate of the modern state and the global city are interconnected here. What's fascinating right now is that we were in a unipolar system with the United States really controlling the world system since the fall of the Soviet Union. Then you had the rise of China and so on. And right now there's no global leadership. You know, I've had friends in other countries tell me, no, people aren't looking to China. Most countries don't trust China for a variety of reasons. They've dropped the ball. And obviously no one's looking to the United States. So where's the global system? So I think the question of where the global system is right now is completely unclear. And that means the question around the modern state is also shifted. So that's my quick response to that. I think that, but Eber, I mean, on the more hopeful side, you would think that given the economic crisis, the health crisis, the climate crisis, and the structural racism crisis is, of course, a global system crisis. It's not just the United States. Obviously, Brazil has its, and it goes around the country. You would think that this is a time for innovative thinking with international institutions. But we're nowhere on that. It's not clear at all. In terms of local PB and the state, I mean, it's a related question, right? The fate of the modern state and the global system very much are going to shape what PB could do and how PB locates itself. And I think that, you know, it goes into your fourth question on the economic impact of PB. And the way that I would answer these two together is that what we're going to have to see is the return of the public sector, of the public sphere, of public services, in health, in the economy, call it the New Deal, call it infrastructure spending, public works, and it's going to have to be a much more participatory model of the public sector. And PB has a very important role to play there alongside other kinds of public and what I call social public configurations between communities and the government. And of course, the most advanced state you might think is the Chinese state at this point, right? In terms of the scope of its power on all levels. And that's not what we would think of as a very social public or community public model. So what do the more participatory forms of these public models look like? And then that's going to tell you how local PBs go forward, and local PBs can play a leadership role in that as well. But I think we already saw the interest in this with the climate crisis because of the necessity of this New Deal, the Green New Deal, so on. And now globally, we're going to be, we have to see that kind of cooperation as well with this pandemic and the next global crisis.
And about the Green New possibilities in this time, what do you think? What's the possible? Because there is Naomi Klein these days. I don't know, last couple of days, she is focused in the Nation the initial conversation. So there is I don't know, but I think AOC, Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, I think spoke about this possibilities. Now this how the possibility of against this crisis, this economic crisis.
Yes. Yeah.
The possibilities by Green New Deal. What do you think? What the people speak this time in U.S. about the Green New Deal in this context?
I did not get to read the Naomi Klein piece, so I don't know if she mentioned this. I think the big opening right now is that when the Green New Deal was put forward 2 years ago, unemployment in the United States was very low. It was like 5%. And that always made it look like, well, why do we need a Green New Deal if everybody already has jobs, and so on. So the fact that so many people are unemployed, 13%, huge numbers, that makes the argument for New Deal or a Green New Deal much more popular and much more pronounced because so many people need jobs and the private sector is not going to be hiring. The private sector in most sectors, because this whole transition's happening. So that's more of an argument for it. The other thing is that we need to rebuild our physical spaces. The pandemic, we know that more green space helps with cleaner air, which helps with the pandemic because people are healthier and not as susceptible to it. And also more social space, getting cars. Now cars are popular again because people don't want to get on the train. This is a big problem. This is a disaster. It's a disaster. The fear of public transport, that's a reality. We have to figure that out. I mean, I don't, but in terms of the street, I think we can take back the street here, ironically, even though the car is more pronounced, and really reimagine that. So Boris Johnson said he's going to go forward with some big national infrastructure in the United Kingdom, in England. It'll be interesting to see how that goes. I think in the United States, people are regrouping. And we'll see, but a jobs program is going to be necessary. There's going to have to be some sort of jobs program in the United States, whether it's green or not, because you're not going to be able to bring people back to work.
Yeah, let me just add that a little bit. I think for as those who are students of history, we are entering a really interesting period that the 2020s, in some ways, are going to be like the 1930s, in that it can go in a progressive direction or in a very bad direction. But the interesting thing is that, and what Michael's saying is very important, is that, for like I've been working since the late 1960s on the issue of what we used to call good environment is good economics. That was always the biggest barrier that we faced in terms of becoming more sustainable. As people thought, well, it's bad for the economy. It costs money, it hurts jobs, and that's what a lot of movements I've been involved in for many years were trying to prove the opposite, which we did to some extent in California over the decades, and that's what sustainable innovation zones are about. But now, because of the COVID crisis, for the first time ever, we have this alignment of creating jobs and incomes to have economic growth and development be lined up with becoming more sustainable and becoming more equitable, so that we have an opportunity to have a really powerful movement for change that's going to reinvigorate the public sector and public investment, and to strengthen the power of the people and participatory democracy in the process of both becoming greener and more inclusive. Now, there's going to be a huge power the other way, like I say, so it could it's not guaranteed which way it'll go. But I do think that the forces are more aligned than ever before, that to be pro the sustainable development goals, to be pro green, to be pro environment, is now connected with strengthening the economy and livelihoods for people?
I would say, Mark, just a quick point on that. We should have done the climate transformation 30 years ago. We knew we had to do it then and so on, and we haven't. And the one kind of positive about that is that it's better in a way from a justice standpoint to take on the structural racism crisis first. And that it's happening right now where there's this incredible movement with muscle, not just with the moral high ground, but is a threat. And Black Lives Matter is a threat, right? Trump recognizes that to white supremacy and the whole foundation of it. And to have that happen first before the Green New Deal means that the Green New Deal has a much better chance of being equitable than if you did not address the structural racism that's just built into this political economic system and did the Green New Deal on top of it. And that's what a lot of the Black and brown communities were saying, right? How do we know this Green New Deal is actually going to help with any of our problems? Well, now, if we've defunded the police, that there's a much better chance that that'll happen.
Yeah, no, that's great. I totally agree. It used to be environmental justice was kind of a separate issue. Now it's at the centerpiece of the Green New Deal movement for the first time.
It has the opportunity to be, yes. And we'll hopefully see that rearticulation.
Fazer uma super síntese, até porque eu tenho a impressão que essa audiência aqui entende razoavelmente, né? Enfim, na minha questão, a última questão que a que articula com a fala do Mark depois foi a respeito de um movimento que é muito forte entre a esquerda do Partido Democrata nos Estados Unidos, o setor mais progressista, digamos assim, né, no Partido Democrata, que é um projeto chamado Green New Deal, né, que seria, enfim, um programa de grandes investimentos econômicos a partir do Estado para uma economia fundamentalmente verde, né, enfim, sem agressão, não mais baseada nos combustíveis fósseis, e a figura, talvez, as duas figuras públicas, I don't know, I think, but it's more important character public about the discussion of the Green New Deal is Naomi Klein, the academic, and I don't know, and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and political, no, that's it. That's possible. Okay, please, Mark.
Point out one thing I think that's fascinating is that we're having election season in the U.S. and a number of progressive activist candidates who were, have won, beating longtime incumbents, running on the Green New Deal. So it's gone from an idea to the beginning of an actual political movement. And that's a powerful and exciting change for the better.
Ok, enfim, a gente está conversando sobre essa perspectiva, né? O Mark agora complementa que pode-se eleger, né, os mais progressistas dentro do Partido Democrata a serem eleitos, tem como uma pauta comum, tendem a ter como uma agenda comum o Green New Deal, né, o projeto do Green New Deal, né? E aí o Michael diz, bom, vai ser necessário um New Deal um New Deal em termos econômicos após essa grande crise. Enfim, aí tem a disputa para que seja um Green New Deal. Eu também perguntei, sobre o papel do Estado moderno, e o Michael fez uma abordagem muito atual a respeito, em alguma medida, de um certo fortalecimento do Estado Nacional nesse momento de pandêmico, em função da crise, digamos assim, dos grandes pontos de contato da globalização, né? Os aeroportos, talvez, como grande imagem da globalização, estão fechados, né? E enfim, a ideia de uma polarização do que seria a globalização, se teria pautada por a China, pelos Estados Unidos. Nossa, também fiz uma pergunta sobre o papel, ligada a essa, né, o papel local do... que amigona, Vitória, a respeito do papel local, da experiência do orçamento participativo, da sua ênfase local e comunitária, e como isso se articularia, em alguma medida, a questão do Estado moderno, e também sobre um efeito econômico da experiência do orçamento participativo, porque é algo que nós aqui, que de certa maneira inauguramos o modelo, nunca tivemos, me parece, muito presente quanto aparece nas formulação do Michael, né? Ou seja, como uma possibilidade de gestão econômica de investimentos públicos e, eventualmente, inclusive, enfim, privados, que é uma disputa. E, por último, um horizonte moral, né, da experiência do orçamento participativo. Michael, please, your finish word today. That's possible?
Yes. So, again, thank you. And I would say that in the essay that I sent that Mark would circulate, at the end of that essay, I say that right now is not a time to institutionalize participatory budgeting. It's a time to use participatory budgeting to transform our institutions. And what I mean by that is, because of Black Lives Matter in the United States, they've not just called for a transformation of police, but a transformation of budgeting. A transformation of budgeting. And that's exactly the right thing to call for right now. Because it's not just the vision right now, it's the process. We have to change the process in the institutions right now, because we're just not responding in the right way to almost anything at this moment in most countries, economically, health-wise, social justice-wise, and so on. So that would be my last comment. And great to see folks, and I look forward to future discussions. And we can be in touch on many channels.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks again
to
Oh yeah, power to the. Hey, all right.
Yeah.
Solidarity.
Yeah. So, thank you, Michael, anymore. And muito obrigado também a todo mundo, todas e todos que participaram, então, hoje de mais esse evento.